Divided by civil war and a training ground for terrorism. We'll examine the chaos that's engulfed Libya since Muammar Gaddafi was toppled from power. I'm Andrew Wilson. This is Insight. Hello and welcome to Insight. 6 years after his father was toppled from power, Muammar Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, has reportedly been freed by the militia that was holding him in Libya. He was captured in the chaos of the 2011 uprising and the international intervention, chaos that remains in a lawless country split by civil war. Now the focus is on Libya once again after the man who carried out the terrorist attack in Manchester, England last month is reported to have travelled to and from the country before the bombing. Libya's lawless areas are said to be training grounds for terrorists. Critics say that's a direct result of the failure of the international intervention. We'll examine its legacy in a moment, but first, Insight's Sarah Firth has been speaking to a former Libyan fighter who knew the Manchester attacker, Salman Abedi.
Libya's disintegration into a fractured, failed state has happened largely out of the glare of the public eye. Once headline fodder, the battle for Libya reached the crescendo when Gaddafi was toppled and then killed. But this jubilation didn't last for long. The transition from dictatorship sent Libya into a downward spiral. Infighting amongst Libya's new leaders and ambivalence from foreign powers has left a country that's been fertile ground for Daesh. But now the spotlight's been recast on the warring country. Back in 2011, during those heady days of the revolution, many young British men of Libyan descent saw the war unfolding and felt compelled to go and fight. A large number of them were from here, Manchester, home to the largest Libyan community in the UK. Among those who went to Libya was Salman Abedi, who carried out the terror attack in Manchester in May that killed 22 people. We spoke to one former fighter who, like Abedi, travelled to Libya during the revolution. He asked that we disguise his voice.
Being a young lad, I was like, look, I'm fit and healthy. Let me go, let me see what I can do. Now, that decision didn't come easily because I knew what my mum and my dad would be like. Once I found myself in the front line, I was thinking, okay, I'm here now. What's actually going on? That's when it first hits you, like, I am there. Do I go back or do I just continue?
The reality of war quickly became apparent.
All kicked off, so it went pear-shaped. And then that's when I stood there and was like, looking, I'm thinking, what am I doing here? And it's literally, that's when you start seeing like bullets flying left, right and centre. It is the real deal. You can't think about it twice now. I mean, if you hesitate, you'll end up killing yourself and somebody else with you. So I was like, you know what, man up, pull my socks up and let's get on with it.
For years, experts have warned about blowback, asking why Britain for so long turned a blind eye to those young teenagers, allowing them to travel freely between the UK and a war zone.
In those days, at the beginning of the revolution, it was okay for everyone to go, and it was done with the full knowledge of the British government, if not with the encouragement.
For the lads from Manchester, fighting in Libya was a badge of honour.
Was there any point when you were spoken to by British authorities?
No.
Was anyone that you knew out in Libya at the time being spoken to by British authorities?
No, and I knew quite a bit of lads that travelled from London to Manchester. Well, as far as I'm aware, nobody actually got approached to, well, if you mean persuaded to go, no. Where they question, where are you going? Yes. And you got away with it easily.
The calls of the Libyan revolution were for freedom and democracy. But what's followed has been chaos and confusion. The ongoing conflict in Libya, for so long ignored in the wake of the Manchester terror attack, now feels much closer to home. Sarah Firth reporting for Insight.
Sarah Firth reporting there. To discuss the elements in her report further, I'm joined by Robert Fox, the defence editor of the newspaper London Evening Standard. He's written extensively about Libya. Also with us on Skype from Birmingham, UK, is Libyan campaigner and activist Bilal Bilali, who I'll be speaking to in a moment. First of all, Robert, it's almost a blueprint, isn't it, these days? You remove an autocratic leader in the Middle East, you don't plan what's going to happen next, and then the resulting chaos is almost inevitable.
Yes, I think the nature of that chaos, as you rightly point to in your question, is absolutely fundamental to this, because I'd be very interested to hear what our colleague says about this. Libya looks as if it has, like Syria, it has very little chance of being a peaceful, stable, unified nation-state now. It's a thing, actually, that the late dictator Gaddafi did understand. That was his genius. He was from a minority tribe, a smaller tribe, and you had to pay the big tribal blocks against each other. Brits always thought that they had a dog in the fight, and when Gaddafi came to fall, I think there was a lot of messing around by British intelligence services. They weren't very intelligent about their involvement, and I think that this is part of, a small part, but significant part, of the lethal cocktail of this traffic in what we call extremists or terrorists, not only from Libya, but Libya does seem to be, I won't say a hub, a node, which infects a lot of other things going on in the region, which are looking pretty ugly at the moment, not only Egypt and Tunisia, neighbouring, but there does seem to be a loop through Morocco. And it's funny we're focusing on the Manchester attack, but there is a remote Libyan link even in the London Bridge attack, because at least two of those protagonists had Libyan-Moroccan links. As the UK, sitting in this capital where we are, London, were warned by the Italian intelligence.
And that contagion will be focusing minds of intelligence services all over Europe, of course. Is there an issue with the fact that Libya tends to be forgotten until it becomes something in the news? We were obsessed about Iraq, and we were obsessed about Syria, and so it was easy for ministers to call in resources to deal with issues with that. But Libya seems to come and go and gets forgotten, and it seems like it's boiling away, and that contagion you mentioned earlier on could, of course, only grow with that.
Absolutely right. It was seen to be almost a sideshow, as you hint, because the population is relatively shallow. It is not a huge population there, although we do have another thing that is spinning, a flywheel, really whirling in this, which is the pressure of Saharan and sub-Saharan migration, which is coming on, expected 6 million on the move coming up from the Saharan regions in this year alone. You're quite right. It's a game of now you see me, now you don't. Libya really wasn't as important as the real centres of gravity in the whole struggle with Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, which was supposed to be in the heartlands of the Levant, the Middle East, in other words, the Gulf, and to an extent Afghanistan, because Afghanistan adds another element into it, which is not particularly relevant to our story today, which is Iran. But what you're right in hinting at, just to draw it together, we're not dropping the pieces of the puzzle in the right order at the moment. And I think in their counter-terrorism strategy, I think the British government, successive British governments, in their policy at home and abroad have been far too complacent.
Indeed. Robert, well, let's bring in our other guest in Birmingham, Bilal Bilali. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I hope you've been listening to what Robert's been saying just now, but also a more general question. Are we right to be worried about the developments in Libya, or should we be worried even more at the moment?
No, I mean, obviously there is a worry. You know, we've had a situation in which since early 2014, it's progressively getting worse. It's, you know, it's declining into further anarchy, and that's been recognised. However, my main concern is that we don't seem to be focusing on the main protagonists in the problems that we're facing right now in Libya. There seems to be a lot of mislabel and a lot of discussion on players that aren't such a major role or haven't created or haven't instigated the situation we have now, whilst ignoring the major players who are possibly more responsible than anyone else for the current situation that the country faces.
Well, such as what major players, for example?
I mean, Colonel Khalifa Haftar, you know, the role which he's played, he's frustrated various peace efforts. It's reached a level for him in which he's slowly losing more and more credibility and support within Libya, and having to resort on militias coming from abroad to prop him up whilst he carries on with his fight in Libya. And the problem is that many people, especially at the start in 2014, were listening to what he was saying, in that he was describing it as a war on terror, when in actual fact it wasn't a war on terror. He was calling it a war on Islamists, and it wasn't a war on Islamists. It was a war against those that were involved in the revolution. But that seems to be getting brushed under the carpet, and whatever statements that Haftar makes seem to be taken as almost as gospel, and that's the situation that we're facing in Libya.
Well, are you heartened at all by the UN support of this Prime Minister now, Fayez Sarraj, and centred more to the west of where the general is based?
I mean, with Sarraj, he seems to be hankered, seems to be straitjacketed for various issues. I mean, all the three governments that we have in Libya, and I won't say we've had, because we still have three governments in Libya, this one seems to be the least legitimate, in that it's the only one in which the people haven't played an actual role in bringing in. The first government is the one where we've had, you know, the 2012 election was the most fairest election we've ever had in the country, ever, period, throughout history. Then what we had in 2014 was a partial democracy in which some areas got ballot boxes, other areas didn't get ballot boxes. There was a war going on at the time, which Haftar had already instigated after his failed coup in Tripoli to take over the government. And then thirdly, you've now got, but there was some form of election going on, and now you've got this third government in which there has been no election at all. It's been parachuted onto the...
Okay, very briefly, Bilal, then what about the problem of contagion? This disturbance, this chaos that exists in Libya is now being referred to in terms of the attacks that we're seeing happening in the UK, for example, with radicalization or training, perhaps, of characters like Salman Abedi. That contagion, is that a situation we're seeing now that could be getting worse?
See, I mean, with regards to the role of Libya, I mean, we can't deny there was some role that Libya must have played in the radicalisation of that young lad, or, you know, whatever it was that happened. But when he went over to Libya in 2011, looking at his date of birth, he was only 16 years old. I was there in Libya on the Eastern Front, and the commanders and the generals that I spoke to from the People's Revolution were fighting against Gaddafi, made it clear we're not taking on anyone under the age of 18. So he would not have been involved in the fighting in 2011. And I don't think that had played any part at all in this young lad's radicalisation. However, in what happened in 2014 and what ensued after the failed coup attempt and the declaration of Operation Dignity, then all of a sudden the situation became very different. And this is what people seem to be missing. We seem to be focusing a lot on 2011 and missing 2014. I think 2014 is when serious problems began in Libya and when the situation really got out of hand. Prior to that, there was some level of security.
Okay, Bilal, thanks very much indeed for the moment. Robert, Bilal mentioning 2014 as being a more important juncture. Comments on that, please, but also just very briefly, if you can, are we looking at the ultimate unavoidability of somebody's boots coming in on the ground, because these trying out and testing governments doesn't seem to be working out?
Yes, following what Bilal said, yes, they then parachuted a government, as he rightly put it, the GNA, which is, you cannot impose by the UN. There have been pious words at the last G7 meeting. It is getting so serious because the regional powers now are getting really worried about what is going on there. Above all, Egypt and Turkey with legitimate interest. Yes, the fact is that actually we're thinking of this in terms of mathematics, of geometric blocks. It's not working like that. It's much more like biology. These things are there, and suddenly we find things go viral. And the one thing that ISIS does seem to be able to do, and seems to be going to North Africa to do it, and not in the heartland, it's doing its cyber war as effectively as ever. The Americans have admitted only today that they really haven't got a handle on this, that they're ahead of them, and this is why it is important As it becomes more of a problem, as the migration problem becomes even more significant, yes, there will be calls for intervention.
Indeed. Robert, thanks very much indeed. Robert Fox there. Our thanks also to Bilal Bilali in Birmingham. Thank you both, gentlemen. You're watching Insight. Coming up, we'll examine Libya's problem with kidnappings. Hundreds of people disappear every year.